From the moment the new Homeowners Association president, Brenda Karen Arnett, stepped onto the wraparound porch of Aspen Grove Estates Community Clubhouse, people knew something was different. Dressed in crisp khaki slacks and a pastel floral shirt, she radiated an aura of polished authority. Her hair, perfectly coiffed and pinned to the back of her head, never had so much as a strand out of place. Her demeanor suggested a woman with a keen sense of her own importance. The cul-de-sac homes lining Maple Crest Lane, Cedar Drive, and Willow Circle were not the grandest in the entire county, but their owners took pride in the neighborhood's tidy lawns and neat flower beds. The small community within Aspen Grove Estates was tight-knit. Families shared lemonade on each other's porches, kids sold cookies and candy bars for fundraisers, and seniors often gathered at a wooden bench in the middle of the communal green area. It was not unusual for older neighbors to congregate there during pleasant afternoons, knitting, reading, or quietly chatting about the day's events. They called themselves the Silver Circle, and while they might have occasionally stirred up a bit of harmless gossip, nobody found their presence disruptive. That is, until Karen joined the HOA board. On her first day as president, Karen took it upon herself to visit various corners of the neighborhood. A careful observer might have noticed her lingering near the bench under the big willow tree, where three older residents, Rhonda, Millicent, and Jake, were swapping stories. Each had served on committees back in the day, from philanthropic ventures to small business councils. They had watched Aspen Grove Estates rise from a dusty construction site into a thriving suburban cluster. Karen approached with measured footsteps, the gentle click-clack of her kitten heels on the sidewalk announcing her presence. Rhonda offered a friendly wave, while Millicent and Jake nodded politely. The new president returned their greetings with a smile so tight it seemed almost painful. They, in their wide-brimmed hats and comfortable clothes, exchanged curious glances. "Hello, I'm Brenda Arnett," she said, gently brushing an imaginary speck of dust from her sleeve. "I just wanted to let you know I've been appointed the new head of the HOA." She hesitated, as though expecting applause, but the seniors simply responded with polite congratulations. "How nice," Jake said, tipping his baseball cap. "I'm Jake Connor. This here is Rhonda. And that's Millicent. We've been around this neighborhood for decades." Karen surveyed the bench, her gaze lingering disapprovingly on a small hamper of lunch items. The older trio had turned the bench into a comfortable lunchtime nook, complete with plastic plates, cups of iced tea, and a jar of homemade pickles. She introduced a mild criticism almost immediately. "Well, as you might guess, I'll be making sure the area is well kept. We certainly don't want leftover food or trash to remain out here, do we?" Millicent, with a gentle grin, assured her, "Oh, we always clean up. We're careful to leave this bench as neat as we found it." Karen nodded, though her polite expression never fully softened. She then gave them a curt wave and marched away. The seniors eyed one another, uncertain what to make of the abrupt tone. They shrugged it off with the easy confidence of people who've seen 100 different personalities over the years. They assumed she might be overeager about her new role. None of them could have anticipated the power trip and pettiness to come. For several weeks, Karen busied herself with typical HOA matters, sending out newsletters, putting together a block party proposal, and reviewing the community's landscaping budget. At the same time, she began issuing small, friendly reminders to various neighbors. One couple received a note about their trash bins being left out for an extra day. A single father was chastised for having a slightly mildewed mailbox. Another resident was scolded for planting flowers that, according to Karen, clashed with the uniform look of the neighborhood. While these admonitions seemed trivial, most neighbors complied, hoping to maintain harmony. But each well-intentioned homeowner also noticed that Karen's directives carried an increasingly imperious tone. She liked to appear at doorsteps unannounced, a notepad in hand, listing concerns with no room for discussion. She seemed oddly fixated on controlling every inch of community space, from how many ornaments one could hang on a holiday wreath to the precise shade of paint for a front door. At first, people found her earnestness borderline comical, like an overenthusiastic hall monitor. Yet, under the surface lurked a tension that would soon erupt. As summer approached, so did warmer evenings, inviting people outside. The seniors found more reasons to meet at the wooden bench near the old willow tree. During these gatherings, they'd sit in the shade, sipping lemonade, nibbling on sandwiches, or just talking about their daily lives, doctor's appointments, family visits, local gossip. Children often biked around them, occasionally stopping to talk about fishing trips or show off new skateboards. No one considered the seniors' presence a nuisance. No one, that is, except Karen. She observed these small gatherings from her upstairs window with a growing sense of indignation. Karen's home was strategically located so that her second-story office had a partial view of the communal green. She watched them from behind lace curtains, a mild frown etched on her face. From time to time, she'd open the window and call down with petty suggestions. Keep your voices down. Not everyone wants to hear about your personal business. Or, mind the trash. No plastic bags blowing around. She even complained about the odor of tuna sandwiches, as if a gentle lunch smell carried all the way to her domain. Still, the seniors tried to keep peace. They lowered their voices, kept lunch breaks brief, and always left the spot tidy. Yet the tension was there, palpable, and impossible to ignore. One morning, Karen marched directly to the bench, the scowl on her face intensifying with each step. Jake was taking out a small container of fruit salad. "Good morning, Ms. Arnett," Jake said politely, though a hint of exasperation lingered under his words. Karen folded her arms, tapping a manicured fingernail against her elbow. "That hamper you keep bringing. Are you ensuring no pests or ants are attracted to the area? We've had issues with pests in the past, you know." Jake looked around. The bench area was spotless. Not a crumb of food or ant in sight. Rhonda had used a plastic mat under the hamper to prevent any accidental spills onto the grass. "Everything's in sealed containers," Millicent offered, doing her best to soothe the conversation. "We're very mindful." Karen's mouth tightened, lips pressed into a thin line. "Yes, well," she said with a sniff, "I must insist that you limit your lunches to certain hours. We can't have people making a habit of prolonged gatherings. It's unsightly. We must keep the neighborhood uniform and quiet." "Limit our lunches?" Rhonda repeated, clearly taken aback. "This area is for community use, right? And the bench is part of the shared amenities. We're just chatting here, same as we've done for years." "Times are changing," Karen replied curtly, as if that ended the matter. She pursed her lips and turned on her heel, striding back toward her house. Her posture made it clear she would not tolerate dissent. The older trio watched her retreat, baffled, but no one wanted a confrontation. They simply shrugged it off once more, quietly resuming their routine. At the next monthly HOA meeting, Karen brought up a motion about appropriate use of common spaces. She claimed that loitering around the communal bench was an issue that some neighbors, though she would never name them, had complained about. She advocated for a fair usage schedule that could, if passed, require residents to reserve the bench area in advance if they planned to sit there beyond 20 minutes. Most neighbors found the idea preposterous. It was a bench in a green space, hardly a heavily trafficked attraction. Yet Karen tried to push the vote through. During that meeting, a few board members expressed mild reservations, but Karen was an expert manipulator. She pontificated about community standards and ensuring everyone's right to peace and quiet. Ultimately, the board decided to table the motion for further review, though Karen pressed for an immediate resolution. Her frustration was evident when the meeting ended with no formal adoption of her rule. Several residents shot apologetic glances at the seniors, who had attended to see whether they might need to defend their casual lunches. Rhonda and Millicent left the clubhouse, shaking their heads. Jake, more outspoken, muttered that Karen seemed determined to control every aspect of their lives. By the beginning of July, tensions had risen noticeably, like summer heat shimmering off the asphalt. People around the neighborhood whispered about Karen's rules and citations. She began placing notes in mailboxes, usually typed in a firm, businesslike font, listing minor infractions: a garden hose left in view from the street, a garden gnome that was not in compliance with design standards, or a holiday flag that hadn't been taken down the day after a particular event. It was petty, but also relentless. Meanwhile, the seniors kept meeting at the bench. They felt a certain defiant pride in their quiet get-togethers, especially since they didn't consider themselves troublemakers. They were retired men and women who spent their free time crocheting, reading newspapers, or reminiscing about old stories. By no means did they see themselves as rebels. Yet Karen seemed fixated on them. as though their presence was a personal affront. If she passed by on foot, she'd shoot them sharp glances or mutter under her breath about wasting community resources. What fueled her animosity toward this simple bench? Some suspected it was envy. The seniors often laughed, shared jokes, and displayed a camaraderie that Karen, a woman with no visible close friends in the neighborhood, lacked in her own life. Others theorized that Karen had a compulsive need for control. The presence of an informal social gathering under her window represented a sphere of communal life she couldn't micromanage. No official bench schedule existed, so it annoyed her that people came and went freely. As for Karen herself, she never revealed her real motivation. She only tightened her grip on the HOA. For instance, she ordered an inspection of the bench's structural integrity. A local handyman arrived one afternoon to test the wooden slats, measure their thickness, and ensure the bench posed no safety hazards. The man concluded that while the bench was a bit old, it was still solid and safe for everyday use. That report did nothing to soothe Karen's displeasure. One sweltering Tuesday, Rhonda and Millicent arrived at the bench around noon with a small picnic basket of turkey sandwiches and iced tea. The shade from the willow tree provided a reprieve from the sun. They sat, fanning themselves with small handheld fans, chatting about their grandchildren's visits for the upcoming 4th of July celebration. Jake joined them soon after, complaining jovially about the humidity. Each time Karen's curtain fluttered in the distance, the seniors felt her eyes upon them. It was disconcerting to say the least. At 1 p.m., they heard a familiar shout from the second floor of Karen's house. She threw open the window and hollered, "Do you have a permit for an extended picnic? People are trying to rest in their homes." Her voice cracked with irritation, stirring embarrassment in the older folks, who had done nothing to warrant such hostility. They exchanged perplexed looks but tried to ignore her. They finished their lunch, cleaned every crumb, and ambled off to their respective houses. 30 minutes later, an email alert chimed in the inboxes of every Aspen Grove Estate resident who had subscribed to the HOA updates. The subject line read, Bench Conduct Policy, Proposed Changes. Karen had typed up a draft that suggested designated usage times for the bench, a maximum occupancy limit, and a ban on food consumption that emits odors or results in litter. A wave of disbelief and frustration spread through the community like wildfire. Parents scoffed at the notion that their children wouldn't be allowed to share an ice cream cone while resting on the bench. A newlywed couple that sometimes read together on the bench in the evenings were outraged. Most tellingly, the seniors found themselves singled out in the email. While their names weren't mentioned, the language obviously targeted them. Jake, furious, wrote a response calling the proposal the most absurd overreach in the history of the HOA. Others chimed in with messages of support for the seniors. Karen, if she noticed the backlash, didn't budge. As the dog days of summer wore on, the entire neighborhood felt on edge. Karen patrolled the sidewalks like a self-appointed warden, scanning for rule violations. More often than not, she'd return to her home and type out another email or post a passive-aggressive reminder on the HOA message board. If she saw kids drawing chalk art on the sidewalk, she'd fuss about defacement of common property. If someone played music at a cookout, even at a moderate volume, she demanded they lower it further. The communal bench became a symbol of quiet rebellion. Residents began to encourage each other to use the bench purposefully. Parents would push strollers by and pause to enjoy the shade. College students home for the summer would read textbooks there, nodding politely at older residents who often joined them for conversation. Everyone suspected that Karen's constant negativity stemmed from a personal vendetta, and they showed solidarity by rallying around the bench. Behind the scenes, however, Karen was growing increasingly agitated. She insisted that the board revisit her motion at the next HOA meeting. She gathered anecdotal evidence of noise disturbances and carefully documented litter, often a single napkin or an empty coffee cup that had blown in from elsewhere. Despite her best efforts, the board still hadn't scheduled a formal vote on her proposal. They found it trivial, or at least not pressing enough to overshadow bigger community concerns such as road maintenance or tree trimming schedules. But Karen was not the type to accept defeat gracefully. On a humid Thursday afternoon, rumors spread that she had confronted an elderly resident named Gerald as he tried to feed a couple of pigeons near the bench. She supposedly threatened him with a fine for unauthorized wildlife feeding, even though Gerald had been tossing breadcrumbs to birds for years without incident. While the rumor was never confirmed, it only added to the sense that Karen's hostility was escalating. In early August, a bigger confrontation occurred. While Jake and Millicent were seated on the bench quietly playing a game of checkers, Karen marched over, phone in hand, claiming she was making a documentary of the neighborhood. She began filming them, demanding they explain why they were on the bench for so long. The older pair stared at her, incredulous. "We're playing checkers," Jake said, pointing at the board on his lap. "And this is public space." Karen's camera phone hovered inches from his face. "Public space doesn't mean it's a free-for-all," she snapped. "You're loitering, and I have evidence." He was so taken aback that he nearly dropped the checkerboard. Millicent tried to reason with her, but Karen just pivoted her phone, capturing Millicent's troubled expression. The bizarre confrontation ended when Karen, unsatisfied with their answers, stalked away, presumably to show the footage to other board members. Word of this incident traveled fast. When neighbors asked to see the video, Karen refused to share it, claiming it was HOA board confidential. People began to pity her in a strange way, because her behavior no longer seemed merely controlling. It bordered on irrational. The seniors, for their part, tried not to let these incidents darken their days too much. Still, a certain amount of resentment simmered under the surface. When the next official HOA board meeting took place, tension was so thick you could taste it in the air. The meeting convened in the community clubhouse, a modest one-story building with a single large room, a small kitchenette, and a handful of folding chairs arranged in rows. Neighbors gathered in greater numbers than usual, eager to see if Karen would push her bench proposal again. And she did, relentlessly. Karen stood at the front of the room, her posture erect, her voice taking on a shrill edge. She presented pages of evidence, including grainy snapshots of seniors seated on the bench at various times of day. The quality was poor, but her scribbled notes in the margins claimed times ranged from 10 a.m. to 3 p.m. She insisted that excessive bench usage was destroying the serenity of Aspen Grove Estates. "I have been approached by countless neighbors," she said, complaining about constant chatter, leftover food scents, and the visual clutter of groups hanging around. "This must be regulated." Several board members exchanged uneasy glances. Countless neighbors, apparently, did not include the many people present who were there to speak out against Karen's attempts to micromanage a simple bench. One board member, Carol Lansing, tried to interject that she lived in an adjacent unit and had never heard a peep from the seniors' conversations. "They're just enjoying the fresh air," Carol pointed out. "I don't understand the big issue." Karen glared at Carol. "It's not just about noise. It's about property values, tidiness, and ensuring we maintain a proper standard." A murmur rippled through the audience. Some elderly residents traded exasperated whispers, while younger couples looked on with frustration. Jake raised his hand, asking to address the board. "Look," he began when recognized. "We've sat on that bench for years, never caused trouble. Brenda, Karen, seems to think we're part of some orchestrated plan to degrade the neighborhood. We just want to sit and talk. That's it." An outburst of applause broke out, quickly hushed by Karen. She insisted the board must pass new regulations. However, the board postponed any formal vote, pushing the issue off the agenda for the foreseeable future. Karen's face reddened with anger as the meeting adjourned. She stormed out, leaving a swirl of frustration in her wake. What no one expected was how quickly matters would escalate beyond mere discussions and proposals. Over the next few days, Karen's mental state took a vindictive turn. She filed a formal complaint with the city's building inspector's office, suggesting the bench was structurally unsound and unsafe. When that brought no immediate results, another inspection declared it perfectly serviceable. She seemed to snap. It was a balmy Saturday night. A slight breeze rustled the leaves of the willow tree, and porch lights glowed softly up and down Maple Crest Lane. Most residents were either inside with their air conditioning humming or enjoying a final stroll before bedtime. The bench sat alone in the darkness, empty for the evening. Shortly after midnight, an ominous scraping sound broke the usual hush. A silhouette appeared near the willow tree, short in stature, wearing some kind of hooded jacket or sweatshirt. The faint glow from a distant lamp post offered just enough illumination to see that the figure was fiddling with the bench. Moments later, a soft mechanical grinding noise disrupted the night. Anyone peering from a nearby window might have wondered if a tool of some sort was being used. Sure enough, Karen had arrived under cover of darkness, carrying a battery-powered reciprocating saw. The savage whir of the blade tore into the wooden slats of the bench. She muttered to herself, quiet curses directed at the bench, the seniors, and perhaps the entire neighborhood for not obeying her dictates. The tool's shrieking noise was audible, but faint enough that most folks slept through it, their windows shut against the humid summer air. Those few who heard it might have dismissed it as an odd mechanical hum in the distance. Karen worked with furious precision, slicing partly through the main supports of the bench's seat. Her plan was insidious. Create a hidden structural weakness, so that the next time the seniors sat there, the bench would collapse. She thought this would make them give up on congregating there. Maybe they would be humiliated enough to stay home, or at least move somewhere else. The idea that she was intentionally sabotaging public property, a petty act of vandalism, didn't seem to trouble her in the slightest. In her mind, she was delivering justice. By the time she finished, sweat beaded on her brow. She paused to survey her work. The cuts were discreet, yet damaging. Someone sitting on the bench wouldn't notice anything amiss until the wooden slats cracked under their weight. She allowed herself a triumphant sneer, shoving the reciprocating saw into a duffel bag. Then she scurried back to her home under the cover of darkness, adrenaline coursing through her. The next day, Sunday, dawned bright and cheerful. The seniors, completely unaware of the malevolent act from the night before, convened as usual around lunchtime. Rhonda brought a plate of deviled eggs, Millicent had a fruit bowl, and Jake arrived with freshly baked bread. They greeted each other with smiles, discussing a neighbor's new puppy and the final outcome of the local baseball team's game. The bench stood in its familiar spot, looking as sturdy as ever under the shade. Karen spied on them from her second-story window, heart pounding with grim anticipation. She watched as the seniors arranged their lunches, set out paper plates, and began to chat. The tension in her was almost electric. She was waiting for the exact moment when the bench would give way. It didn't take long. Millicent shifted her weight slightly to reach for the fruit bowl. With a dreadful crack, the weakened slats snapped beneath her. She let out a startled yelp as the entire bench caved in. Jake's plate tumbled out of his hands, scattering bread slices across the grass. Rhonda squealed in alarm, struggling to keep her balance as she toppled onto the ground. Fortunately, none of them suffered serious injuries, though Millicent's wrist banged against one of the jagged edges, leaving a shallow scratch. Plates, sandwiches, eggs, and fruit scattered across the green. The seniors, more shocked than hurt, scrambled to stand on shaky legs. Millicent grimaced, rubbing her wrist, while Jake tried to pick up the bits of lunch strewn everywhere. Rhonda, heart racing, exclaimed, "What happened? I thought that bench was fine." Above them, Karen's curtain fluttered. She let out a small exhalation, an unnerving mixture of satisfaction and panic. She had gotten what she wanted. The bench was effectively out of commission. But the seniors' immediate confusion gave way to growing suspicion. After all, the bench had been inspected not too long ago and declared safe. How did it suddenly give way so dramatically? Jake helped Millicent into a nearby folding chair that had been left in someone's yard. Concerned neighbors who had witnessed the collapse from across the street rushed over. A flurry of questions erupted. "Are you hurt? What happened to the bench? It just collapsed out of nowhere." Karen, wanting to appear innocent, took her time before emerging. By the time she reached the scene, a small crowd had gathered. She put on a mask of concern, pressing her hand dramatically over her chest. "Oh my goodness. Is everyone all right?" she gasped, though an astute observer might have noticed a certain glint in her eyes. Jake looked at her suspiciously, but he had no proof. "We're fine, except Millicent might have sprained her wrist." Karen fussed over Millicent with an exaggerated show of compassion, urging her to see a doctor if necessary. Meanwhile, neighbors inspected the ruined bench. Someone noticed the cuts in the wood. These slats were tampered with, a man named Lucas declared, running his fingers over the saw marks. This wasn't an accident. A collective hush fell over the group. Eyes began shifting in Karen's direction. She quickly shook her head, feigning shock. Tampered? Who would do such a thing? She projected outrage at the thought of sabotage. The seniors were not naive. They harbored immediate suspicions about who would have the motive to ruin the bench. However, they had no direct evidence to implicate Karen. As neighbors whispered among themselves, a wave of anger filled the air. It didn't matter who was behind this dastardly act. The community was now galvanized. The destruction of the seniors' bench felt like an attack on the entire neighborhood's sense of togetherness. The day after the bench collapsed, the seniors filed a formal complaint with the HOA board. They also contacted the local police to report vandalism. An officer came to inspect the site, took photos of the saw marks, and interviewed neighbors who had witnessed the aftermath. Although the culprit remained unknown officially, whispered accusations against Karen grew stronger. But Karen remained outwardly calm, pivoting the conversation in a new direction. Now that the bench is gone, we have an opportunity to replace it with something more suitable, she announced during an impromptu HOA meeting. She suggested an official beautification project, though she hinted that perhaps a bench was no longer an ideal installation. Maybe we should just put in a flower bed, she said. Something that requires less sitting and gathering. Neighbors, however, had a very different idea. In a moment of solidarity, they pooled their funds to purchase a brand new, sturdy metal bench with comfortable cushions and built-in planters on each side. A group of local teenagers volunteered to assemble the bench and place it under the willow tree. They even added an umbrella for shade. It became a community-led effort, each family contributing in some small way, either through labor, materials, or money. The whole endeavor happened quickly, as though everyone wanted to defy whoever had destroyed the original wooden bench. Karen could only watch in mounting frustration. She tried to file an objection with the HOA board, claiming the bench was being installed without proper permits or architectural review. But this time, the board voted 4-1 in favor of allowing the new bench to remain. Karen was the lone dissenter. The official reason cited for bypassing certain permit steps was exceptional circumstances following vandalism. Karen's meltdown at the meeting was visible to all. Her face reddened. Her voice quavered with rage as she realized no one was backing her attempt to block the bench installation. When the new metal bench arrived, it was a moment of community celebration. Neighbors came out to help bolt it into place. Kids handed over washers and screws. The seniors stood around, cheering each advancement. The final touch was a set of weather-resistant cushions that Jake's daughter had donated, embroidered with tiny flowers. A wide umbrella rose from the center, ensuring a shady spot on even the brightest days. Karen, from her vantage point by her second-floor window, looked on in silent fury. Her attempt at sabotage had not only failed but backfired spectacularly. Now the seniors had an even better, more comfortable bench that would likely last decades. Worse, the entire neighborhood had come together in support of the project, forging stronger bonds in direct opposition to her overreach. Though the HOA board had typically followed protocol regarding elections and leadership terms, Karen's tenure was overshadowed by her increasingly erratic behavior. After the bench incident, many residents felt uneasy about her presence. The rumor mill churned with speculation about her role in the vandalism. She was never officially charged. Police found no physical evidence linking her to the saw or the act, but she was tried in the court of neighborhood opinion. Some neighbors confronted her directly. "Why are you so hostile toward a simple bench?" They never received a satisfactory answer. Karen responded with bluster, denying all allegations and painting herself as a victim of gossip. Her meltdown reached new heights when she tried to impose a new round of rules, targeting everything from permissible plants in front yards to how often one could use the community grills. Finally, Carol Lansing, the board member who had previously spoken against Karen's bench restrictions, led a motion for a special recall election. According to the HOA bylaws, if a significant percentage of residents signed a petition, they could hold a vote to remove the HOA president. Signatures piled up fast. A sense of relief spread through the neighborhood. People were ready for a new leader who valued cooperation over control. On the day of the recall election, a large crowd gathered at the clubhouse. Karen stood near the refreshment table, arms folded, glaring at each person who approached the ballot box. Despite her intimidating demeanor, the vote was a landslide. Residents overwhelmingly favored her removal from the presidency. Just like that, Karen lost her official position of power. She was furious. She hurled accusations of bias and corruption at the other board members, but she lacked the authority to do anything further. A new president was appointed, Carol Lansing herself, who promised to restore harmony to the HOA and approach community issues with genuine dialogue instead of heavy-handed mandates. In the weeks that followed, the new bench became a cherished spot. The seniors resumed their lunches, now on even sturdier seating, delighted to discover that the metal bench's design provided better back support. They no longer had to worry about slivers or rotting wood. Meanwhile, the older bench's remnants were hauled away, a testament to the petty vandalism that had led to Karen's downfall. The entire neighborhood seemed to breathe easier without Karen in a leadership role. She remained in her house, of course. One couldn't just force her to move away. But her influence waned. Where once she prowled the streets handing out citations, she now mostly stuck to shrill Facebook posts or pointed next-door rants, complaining about minor infractions. Fewer people listened. Over time, even the bitterness softened. Neighbors rarely saw Karen unless she had some new complaint, but they treated her with a mix of cautious politeness and guarded distance. The seniors, in particular, were philosophical. "She's her own worst enemy," Jake commented one afternoon while setting up a board game on the new bench. No need to stoop to her level of pettiness. Millicent, wearing a wrist brace from her minor injury, nodded thoughtfully. "We've got a new bench out of it," she said with a wry smile. "And the whole neighborhood pulled together in a way I haven't seen in years." Indeed, the fiasco seemed to cement bonds among neighbors. Block parties felt more joyful. Kids played more freely on the sidewalks, and those occasional HOA meetings were no longer fraught with tension. Carol Lansing, the new president, encouraged open forums where anyone could voice concerns in a respectful environment. Issues were addressed through reasoned discussion rather than unilateral demands. Karen's meltdown had become something of a local legend. People jokingly referred to her as the Saw Lady or Bench Wrecker, though rarely to her face. As for Karen herself, she wore her bitterness like a cloak. She refused to apologize or accept responsibility for the sabotage. But ironically, her tantrum gave the seniors an even nicer setup for socializing, one sanctioned and partly funded by the HOA itself. In that sense, she had only succeeded in strengthening the sense of community she had tried so hard to control. Life returned to a tranquil rhythm at Aspen Grove Estates. In the green space under the willow tree, the brand-new metal bench gleamed in the sunlight. Birds hopped around the umbrella stand, occasionally swooping down to peck at crumbs dropped by the seniors and other visitors. Conversations flowed freely among the older residents who gathered there, from harmless gossip about the latest gardening techniques to lively debates on current events. One warm afternoon, as Millicent, Rhonda, and Jake prepared a small spread of homemade cookies, lemonade, and fresh fruit, Karen emerged from her house, drawn by the activity below her window. She paused on her porch, arms folded, looking as though she wanted to march over and scold them. But the moment she saw multiple neighbors congregating around the bench, young parents, a few retirees, even a teenager with a skateboard, she realized her outrage would find no sympathetic audience. She lingered for a moment, as if weighing whether to stomp over and cause a scene. Then, likely remembering her downfall and the humiliating recall vote, she silently turned back inside, shutting the door behind her. From that day forward, the bench remained a place of gathering and unity. And while Karen might watch from behind her curtains, fuming at the lively chatter and clinking of iced tea glasses, she could not erase the one truth that mattered most. The community had chosen togetherness over tyranny. They had spoken with their actions, with their votes, and ultimately with their laughter shared on a brand new bench that outshone the old one in every way. All that was left of Karen's sabotage was a cautionary tale. How one person's aggression can, ironically, bring out the very best in everyone else.